Hello everyone and welcome to the Drydock episode 171. This week the questions are taken from Guide 224 on the Caio Duilio class ironclads of the Regia Marina, the Italian Navy, and the Wednesday video on 18th century naval food, so you can probably guess what some of the questions coming up are going to be like. King Quacky asks, would using ship's biscuit as a form of armour work? And did you do any jaw workout before you ate the hardtack? So, jaw exercises? No, that was literally just straight in and crunch. In terms of using ship's biscuit as a form of armour, yes, actually. I mean, you saw when I pounded it with a medieval axe hammer thing. Not quite a poleaxe, but you know what I mean. It did end up crumbling up relatively well. But, two things. One, it took a fair old force to do that. And two, although it shattered, the table underneath wasn't damaged, and I can assure you that if that hammer had just hit the table directly, there would have been some fairly major dents. So it was distributing the force fairly well. I don't think it would have worked particularly brilliantly against large-scale blunt force trauma. And I mean, obviously it comes in relatively small sizes, so you'd have to turn it into some kind of scale armor. But it's certainly strong enough to withstand a couple of good hard cuts by a sword or something like that. So, I mean, it wouldn't necessarily be the world's best armour, and you would be literally wearing your food, but I suppose in extremis it could serve. I mean, if you were worried about being cut across the chest, I think you could maybe stuff a few in your pockets, in your breast pocket or something. That will probably keep you alive, which would be somewhat amusing, but it would be far from the most strange object to have ever stopped a cut or thrust when that object was being stored in somebody's pocket. Gepida asks, out of all the food-related technology -- nutritional advances, which was the most influential or important? Well, I'd say it probably runs between three things. First, the widespread issue of alcohol, even if diluted, instead of just water on the ships, because that enabled ships to travel for a considerably longer period of time away from land and away from fresh water sources, because of course you can go a fair amount of time without food. You're not going to go any particular great length of time without water, and so the purifying effects of the alcohol were quite important. Canning is sometimes, or canning or refrigeration or both, sometimes cited as another very important step, and it was a very important step. However, both canning and refrigeration allowed better quality and wider variety ingredients to be taken on a ship. If a ship needed to go on a very long voyage, the more traditional storage methods of salted meat and biscuit would still suffice. It just wouldn't be a particularly exciting diet. So for me, I think the single biggest advance in food or technology or issue at sea has to be the issue of first lemon juice and then lime juice to cure scurvy, because prior to that, if you went on any long voyage, you could do it because your ship could sail that far and your food supplies would last that long. But when you're talking about the late 15th and then 16th and even early 17th centuries, if it was known that a ship or a flotilla of ships was going to go on a long voyage, the captain and the backers of the voyages were budgeting on at least a third of the men not coming back due to things like scurvy. And quite often it was considerably more. I mean, just look at Admiral Anson's unintentional round-the-world voyage and compare the number of men that went out at the beginning with the number of men who came back. And even once you account for those lost when their ships went down, you'll see massive numbers of people just dropping dead because of scurvy and all the related problems that came with that. So I think that issue of, well, citrus juice basically becomes the most important thing, because it then enabled long distance voyages to be undertaken where, you know, apart from things like unfortunate circumstances and battle, you could probably rely on the vast majority of your crew still being alive at the other end. And of course, that is where the British got given the term limeys, because they're being given lime juice at the time that the name was stuck. But it's important to note that the original experiments called for lemon juice, and the Royal Navy did initially start with the lemon juice, but they were forced relatively rapidly by war, cutting off the supplies of lemons, to go with limes instead, which they could more easily access. And it was during that period, when they were primarily using lime juice instead of lemon juice, that they picked up the nickname. C. Wallace asks, is it true that grog and rum weren't ubiquitous, being replaced with things like wine when it was locally available? Yes, in the earlier years this was true. I mean, by the time you get to steamships and regularly predictable sailing, it's pretty much all ships will have a rum ration, obviously if we're talking about the Royal Navy. But in the earlier days, in the age of sail, whilst rum, which could then be turned into grog, was by far the most widely available drink for men of the Royal Navy, because it was A, very cheap, which is always attractive to the Royal Navy at the time, and B, it could be acquired in large quantities from a number of different areas, because obviously they could make it in the Caribbean, but there were also quite large rum distilleries in the UK, processing materials that have been brought back from the Caribbean. And since those two areas tended to either be the bases for, or at least the origin points for, large numbers of Royal Navy warships, they would generally be carrying rum aboard for the alcohol rations. However, in the event that a ship began to run low or run out of supplies, and they couldn't find a nearby port that was friendly and stocked additional rum, and that was not necessarily the most difficult thing. The Admiralty actually had a relatively decent logistics chain going at times during the latter part of the Age of Sail, but, you know, if you were caught short, then whatever was to hand that would be vaguely adequate would be adopted. I mean, the French used wine quite a bit, so wine would also be available in some places. Gin was also occasionally used when they couldn't get their hands on rum or wine. So, yeah, locally available products were absolutely necessary, but as the Age of Sail wears on, at least for the Royal Navy, the fact of it necessarily having to go for locally sourced alcohols became significantly less and less, and by the age of steam and steel it would be practically unheard of to have anything but. Yang M wants to know, hi Drac, where was the mic when you were eating the salted beef and the hardtack glass? Just wanted to know for a better idea of how loud it would be in real life, or could Mrs. Drac comment on how loud it was or how far away it was audible? Well, here's the shot, and no, I wasn't wearing a lapel mic of any description. The camera was set up on a tripod on the other side of the kitchen island when I was eating it, and, well, let's put it this way, that island is 4 foot across, the camera was about a foot further back, and I was about a foot back from the other side, so you're talking about probably a 6 foot clear air gap to the camera's onboard microphone, and, yeah. So through that airspace, plus obviously coming through my face, because I do eat with my mouth shut, yeah, it's pretty loud when you chew down on that hardtack. I have a feeling that mealtimes in Royal Navy warships probably would have sounded something like rolling a barrel down a gravel drive if you were down on the gun decks. It wasn't the most pleasant of experiences. I wouldn't necessarily say it's one of the worst. It bizarrely does actually grow on you after a while, especially once you combine it with the butter and cheese. Goober Chen was one of several people who made a fairly important observation, so I'm basically going to read out what he said so people understand. He said, hi Drac, quick correction, the saltpetre, which was part of the ingredients originally listed on one of the period recipes for preserving meat, which I didn't really claim much understanding of, but anyway, he says the saltpetre is not for flavour, although it does impart a look, texture and flavour to the meat. The saltpetre is an absolutely positive necessary aspect of proper salt curing. It's a compound of potassium nitrate. The nitrate is the important part. In modern times, we cure meat with something called Prague powder, which contains sodium nitrate, of which, again, the nitrite is the important part. What it does is bond with the hemoglobin in the meat and produce the characteristic pink coloration of cured meats. This is why cooked pork is white in colour, but cooked ham is pink, despite it being the same cut of meat. The difference in flavour and texture between pork and ham is also largely a function of the nitrites. Ham is cured pork. The purpose of the nitrite cures, like saltpetre, aside from taste and texture, is to prevent botulism from forming in the meat during curing and storage. Regular salt does not prevent botulism. Once more for emphasis, regular salt does not prevent botulism. Nitrite cures are an absolute necessity and a non-substitutable part of properly curing meat. In short, don't eat what you just made. Botulism is odourless, colourless, and the meat will seem perfectly fine until it makes you so sick you want to die. Please don't eat this meat when you're done. You haven't cured it properly and it's not safe to consume. Also, the nitrates are an exact science. Precise amounts must be added per ounce of meat being cured because too much nitrate can also make you sick. Well, the good news is that now you know it, and now I know it, for future meat preservation. The bad news is that, I kind of did eat the rest of the salt beef over the following week after I filmed that particular video. Did I die? Sadly, yes. But I lived. Liam Robbins asks, how would local time affect ships' meal times? Were they eaten at meal times compared to local solar noon, or kept at meal times in the UK? Well, for the age of sail, it was done by your local time, because happily, for pretty much the most of the age of sail, if you were cruising along in your ship under normal sails, your rate of advance, whilst obviously you would be moving between time zones, was slow enough that you could just adjust your body naturally, for the most part, to the local cycle of the sun and whatever local noon happened to be without much issue. Jet lag when you're cruising at 4 to 6 knots is not really a thing. Now, later on, once reliable timekeeping pieces became available, you could actually then work out what the time was back in London. And obviously once steamships came around and speed started to increase, you could also now sail at a slightly faster clip, to the point that the changes in local solar noon from day to day might actually start to stagger your meal times, or possibly compress them, depending on which way you're going, somewhat. But also, by that point, because you have the accurate timepieces, you can also work out exactly what adjustments you need to make to keep an approximate even split of times between various meal times. So, as best as could be done, the ship's meal times would correspond to the local solar noon times, wherever possible. And this is simply because the pattern of watches and everything, all the work that the men are doing, is all pretty much tied into what's going on at the time there anyway. Now, okay, these days, I guess, in submarines and things where you don't really have much of a day-night cycle outside of what the sub sets, there's probably a much more dependent on local port time. Possibly. I don't know exactly what the day-to-day life inside a modern nuclear sub is like, but on the surface at least, there's precious little point if you are, halfway around the world, of trying to insist that noon is in fact midnight and midnight is in fact noon. It's just silly, so you go with whatever the sun tells you locally. D675OZSE asks, main gun turrets, especially during repeated actions, how did the turret crews on the larger main batteries prevent serious injury from blast effects? With super large artillery on land in the open, it's often documented that crews fired guns remotely. How would a battleship or battlecruiser deal with this? This was one of the, in some cases unintended, but very practical effects of having the guns in turret mountings, but also from the way that gun blast works. With howitzers and everything, the muzzle is much closer to people, so therefore the effects are going to be felt a lot more harshly. Obviously, there is some long barrel field artillery, but that tends to be, as you mentioned, in a kind of open mountings. Now, what you're seeing on the screen here is the pressure wave for a US 16-inch 50 caliber gun when it fires, with that little cluster in the middle, on the middle left being, the muzzle of the gun. And you can see there's some extremely high pressures forward, things you really do not want to get in the way of. But actually, the pressure is reducing pretty quickly down to, relatively speaking, low pressures at fairly short distances when you're looking at behind the gun. And of course, in the gun turrets, all the gun crews are well behind the muzzle. And the muzzle itself is obviously at the end of the barrel. The barrel is going to be quite a few meters long, so you've got to take that off of this equation, because obviously 0 is at the muzzle. Plus, the turret face will deflect a certain amount of the blast that's coming back, and some of it will come in through the elevation ports for the guns that are firing. But when it does that, it's coming through into a larger volume than obviously the small volume of the gun ports that it's coming through, and it's going to expand into that. And once you add all of that together, it's actually not too bad to be down behind the guns whilst they're firing relatively constantly. Where you can get some fairly major issues is if somebody starts firing the guns over the top of or next to your turret, because then of course that major pressure wave you see at the front, well, that's not going to affect the gun that's firing. But if, let's say, you're thinking about two forward turrets and the guns are pointed at 45 degrees off of the bow, then at that point, your 60, 40 or 30 psi pressure wave is going to be washing over the turret in front of you, which will not do kind things to the crew unless they're completely sealed up, which is one of the other reasons why turrets are sealed up. And even then, there's going to be some pressure transfer, as opposed to, the gun crew in the turret, where a 3 or 5 psi pressure wave might be making its way through the gun turret faces, which means by the time it reaches them, it's actually not going to be all that much. So basically, it was a combination of three things. One, the turrets themselves provided a certain degree of blast protection. Two, the gun barrels were long enough that even without the turrets, the gun crews would usually be far enough behind to not be subjected to the absolute worst effects of the blast. And three, you would try to not fire guns on too fine an angle such that your muzzle blast might batter the turret in front of it and partially obviate the aforementioned safety features. HS asks, the German ships of World War II seem to have generally inferior anti-aircraft weaponry compared to their Allied contemporaries, and less than adequate anti-aircraft defence as a result. If you were in charge of German ship design, what would you do to make German naval anti-aircraft defence up to a par with or superior to their Allied contemporaries? Well, the way I see it, you'd have to start pretty early, sort of early 1930s, say 33 or 34. But if you started back then the two main pushes I would make be, one, to push the German 127mm or 5-inch gun definitely in the direction of becoming a dual-purpose weapon. It's the same caliber as the US 5-inch 38. It's a 5-inch 45, so it's a bit of a longer barrel. But the Germans did make a pretty decent dual-purpose gun out of the 127mm eventually towards the end of the war. But they had 127mm being installed on destroyers that were built all through the 1930s. So I'd put a lot more emphasis and R&D into making sure those mounts were actually fully dual-purpose, because not only does that give the destroyers much better form of air defence, but it also means I can use that as a unitary secondary battery across the heavy cruisers and battleships as well, which will mean a lot of anti-aircraft defence on something like a Bismarck that might actually be of some use. The 20mm that the Germans have is okay, but so there's not really much reason to change that for the period that the 20mm is actually valid frontline AEA defense weapon. The biggest problem comes when it comes... gets to the medium anti-aircraft category, i.e. the slot that in the Allied navies would be occupied by the pom-pom and the Bofors. Now, it might be easy to say, oh, yes, well, just, get a license from Bofors to build the Bofors 40mm, and yeah, okay, that might well be one way of doing it. But the Germans had a 37mm gun. Admittedly, it wasn't that good at all. But again, like the 127mm, they did eventually come up, in this case in mid-war, with a much better, higher rate of fire and generally overall superior 37mm gun to what they'd had previously. So if you don't want to take the easy path and say, oh yeah, we're just going to get a Bofors license, then again, assuming you're acting in the mid-1930s, you could fast forward or railroad the development of a much better 37mm anti-aircraft gun. And yeah, if you have either a Bofors 40mm or a historically early better 37mm plus actual dual purpose 127s, you're going to have a far more capable anti-aircraft defense than historically the Kriegsmarine enjoyed. Of course, you've also got to make decent mounts and fire control, but that's a completely separate issue. Scott Mason asks, what would the outcome have been if the Bismarck had gone against the Richelieu in battle? Honestly, I'd be fairly confident in putting my money on Richelieu, because whilst she is a slightly lighter vessel, she's a much better designed one. In anything other than a close-range slugging match, she has by far a superior armour scheme. She's got overall thicker armour than Bismarck does, and it's arranged with a sloped main belt and then a conventional all-or-nothing deck, which means that at longer range, sort of mid to long range fire, that belt should be fairly capable of withstanding Bismarck shells, especially considering, because Richelieu's armament is all forward, she can angle herself somewhat. Now, I'm not talking about like auto-bouncing shells and things, but it does increase the overall instant angle, which makes the apparent armor thickness considerably greater, whereas Bismarck can only come to a limited angle because it has its aft guns to bring to bear, or it has to accept fighting Richelieu on terms where Richelieu has 8 guns and Bismarck only has 4. Additionally, thanks to some rather interesting boilers that the French use, Richelieu is a bit faster than Bismarck. And of course, as I said, they both have 8 15-inch guns. Both sets of guns have fairly decent characteristics. The Germans have problems with duds. The French initially have problems with their shells exploding in the barrel. But assuming that neither one of those things bites or that they've resolved them, so it might be a late war confrontation, or resolve them to a degree at least, on the German side, then you're talking about approximately equal main batteries, but Richelieu has the ability to get into position better because of the additional speed. It's got the speed to be able to keep that advantageous position in all but the most extreme circumstances, and it can take the punishment somewhat better than Bismarck can. So, whilst obviously in the great schemes of warfare, you can get random lucky hits that might doom one side or the other a lot quicker than you might otherwise think, I think overall Richelieu has a probably 70 to 80% chance of taking it, so it's kind of 70-30 or 80-20 in favour of the French battleship. Unemployed History Major asks, how does a nation justify a ship that can only fire 4 shots per hour, and what use does that abysmal rate of fire have in a conflict? Well, when you're looking at the time period in question, i.e. kind of the middle of the Ironclad age, there really isn't much other choice when you look at the technology that's available, because if you go for smaller and therefore more rapidly firing weapons, well, some of these ships are carrying 2 foot of armour. Granted, it's iron and later compound, but if you take a 10-inch gun into a fight like that, the ironclad with 2 foot of armour is just going to laugh at you and your shells are going to bounce off. So you can fire as many shells as you like. It's not going to do a tremendous amount. And bear in mind, in the ironclad era, you have a lot of ships which are basically armoured hulls with guns stuck on them and precious little else. There's not much in terms of superstructure or anything like that to set fire to. And the range and accuracy is also not particularly brilliant anyway. Once rate of fire is increased with the advent of quick-firing guns, you obviously then start to see the development of secondary and tertiary batteries. But in the grand scheme of things, with the kinds of ships represented by the early turreted ironclads and so forth, the simple fact of the matter is that those big guns, whilst they may be incredibly slow in firing, are pretty much the only weapons on the planet capable of smashing through the enemy's main armour. And if you can't smash through the enemy's main armour, well then his guns are protected and can fire back at you, his magazines are protected and can supply ammo to the guns, and his engines are protected and can keep the ship moving. So you're basically faced with have a very slow, very inefficient main weapons system that, at least if it scores a hit, will cripple or destroy a vessel, as opposed to have more numerous smaller weapons which at that time period probably don't have a tremendously greater rate of fire in some cases, and even if you do score multiple hits, you're probably not actually going to do anything meaningful. It's one of the reasons why ramming A became a thing and B, so many people heartily embraced it. In terms of how you use them in a conflict, you sail them into action against ships with an equally abysmal rate of fire and wait until somebody scores a single fatal blow. Captain Seafort asks, when and why did the terminology used for identifying naval weapons change? At the start of the 19th century, weapons were defined almost universally by weight of shot, with a few exceptions for howitzers and mortars. By the end of the century, gun calibre was used almost universally, with the weight of shot being retained at the lower end of the scale in a few navies, and in between there's a hodgepodge of projectile weights, calibres, and as with Caio Duilio's armament, the weight of the overall weapon. How did these definitions evolve? Were there sharp cut-offs where a given navy decided to start using a different system, or was it a much more gradual process? Well, as you indicated, at the start of the 19th century, shot weight was pretty much the most important thing. Apart from anything else, the exact calibre of gun was not a precise measurement. You might have a gun, let's say a cannon, that shoots a certain poundage of ball, but if you measured the bore diameter of, say, all the guns of that poundage on a ship of the line, you might find that it could be, say, between 5 and 5.2 inches. So trying to standardise on a particular bore size was pretty much a hiding to nothing. Theoretically, there was a specific bore size that people reckoned would fit that particular shot best, but the accuracy on actually boring the gun was fairly low, and this is why when you had elite gunners on ships of the line and frigates in the Age of Sail, they'd often sort through all the guns they had on board to try and find which one most closely matched the standardised shot they were getting, and therefore would be the best candidate to give as a bow chaser for an elite gun crew. Now, because the shot weight was the most important and guns tended to come in kind of standardised sizes, this is how it was for a very long time. But towards the end of the Age of Sail, there was a little bit more of a shift to have different weights of the same calibre of gun. So you might have a 32-pounder regular long gun, and whereas right back at the sort of 15th century and earlier, you might have that defined as culverin, sakers, cannons, demi-culverins, etc., etc. By the 19th century, you had carronades coming into place, and that was somewhat helpful because you could have a 32-pounder carronade or a 32-pounder cannon. They'd weigh very different but shoot the same ball, but the difference between the two was quite radical. But then you had things like the US ships of the line trying to introduce 32-pounders across all their decks, which meant you now effectively had a really heavy long 32-pounder and then a medium grade 32-pounder and then almost a sawn off, not quite carronade 32-pounder. And as a result, they now had to start being referred to with a notation for weight. And as this progressed, as you get towards kind of the time of HMS Warrior, when you've got 68-pounders, 64-pounders, 110-pounders, etc., there is beginning to be more and more a notation of the gun weight as well as the shot poundage, because the different, obviously, sizes and weights of guns makes them more or less suitable for different locations and different ships, and gives them different performance characteristics. And then as you start to enter into the ironclad era proper, then the weight of the gun, because of the sheer size of the gun, gives a little bit more of an indication of actual hitting power rather than any particular caliber or shot weight, because you could have a, let's say, a 110 pounder gun that was a relatively high velocity, low caliber weapon, and you might have a 110 pounder gun that fired actually quite a physically broad shot at a relatively low muzzle velocity. But the smaller gun would weigh considerably less than the big kind of almost shotgun style weapon, and so at that point the weight of the gun started to become relatively important. And as you can see here, the 100-ton gun, also the 17.2 inch gun, when it was officially noted, both weight and caliber were noted, and this kind of thing would continue from the age of sail through well into the 20th century. But colloquially, and as an ease of reference, the weight was the slightly easier thing to reference. But that particular trend, it didn't last very long. It kind of, as I say, picks up in the middle of the 19th century, but towards the middle half of the second half of the 19th century, it's already beginning to die away again, because by the time you hit the mid-1880s and then into the 1890s, you have got the situation almost kind of like you did back at the beginning of the century, where people are manufacturing different guns of different weights but in the same caliber. So there could be like say a 12-inch gun, and it might come in 35 or 38 or 44-ton variants. So now if you said, oh, well, I have a 44-ton gun on this ship, and someone else might say, oh, yes, well, that's nothing. Well, I've got a 50-ton gun. Well, actually, that 44-ton gun might be more powerful than the 50-ton gun, which might just be a big smasher, rather than a high-speed armor piercer. And as armor piercing became more and more important, obviously that became a predominant factor. So at that point, you start to see the reference switching back again over to caliber. So you can say, oh, I have a 12-inch gun or a 13-inch gun or a 6-inch gun. And then you start also including the caliber or length of the barrel. So, 12-inch .35 or 11-inch .40, because that gives you a rough idea of how its muzzle velocity will compare to other guns. So if someone says, oh yes, well, my battleship's armed with 12-inch 40 caliber weapons, and someone says, well, my battleship's armed with 12-inch 30 caliber weapons, well, the first guy's guns, all other things being equal, are probably going to hit harder. But remnants of the older systems do still survive. For example, when the JK, L, N, M, and N destroyer flotillas are being built, you look at them, they're all being built with 4.7-inch guns. This is in the immediate run-up to World War II. But the L and M classes are designed around a gun that, although 4.7-inch in caliber, fires, I believe it's a 67-pounder. I think it's 67-pounder. It's 60-something pounder shot, as opposed to the 50-something pounder shot of the gun that's on the J's and later the N's, because they're repeat J's. So they're still referring to it by that, because there is still this feeling, the weight of shot might have a bearing on range and armor penetration again. And so you'll see Royal Navy notes from that particular design period for those particular destroyers, and because it's the same caliber, they'll be referring to the guns as by their shot weight rather than anything else. So there is no particular sharp cut-off one way or another. It's a gradual process depending on the navy. Some navies don't adopt certain ways of measuring at all. Other navies adopt multiple ways of measuring, and as we just saw, even by World War II, some navies are using several different types of measuring system depending on what they think best suits that particular description of the project. Thomas asks, regarding strategically important waterways, whether that be economically or militarily, like the Suez and Panama canals or narrow harbour entrances, how are they protected in times of war? Surely just one submarine able to attach a limpet mine to a ship or smuggle a bomb into a cargo could sink a block ship in the channel that would take months to clear. Did the Germans or Japanese ever try marine assault? Well, in the World War One and World War Two era of submarine warfare, whilst obviously the Italians proved that you could in fact place limpet mines on ships, that was a special operation targeting a harbour for infiltration. It's not the kind of thing that you could do to an actively moving ship at sea. And in wartime, unlike in peacetime, ships would not tend to dawdle off of ports where they might be vulnerable to that kind of thing, amongst other things. They would proceed from port A to port B, and from protected anchorage within said port to protected anchorage within said other port. So the chances of any ship being stationary long enough to have something attached to it or smuggled aboard it are pretty much slim to none. Now, with that said, simply just blowing up such a vessel, whether by air attack or torpedoes, in a narrow harbour entrance or in a canal, was something that the various Axis powers looked at. Occasionally, people would try to do this with things like the Suez Canal and so forth, but it was difficult enough to hit a moving ship, and at the best of times. And although when they're in a narrow, confined waterway, they're somewhat easier to hit because they're less able to evade, it's also much easier to provide defences to that location in the form of fighters and anti-aircraft guns, etc., which, compounds the difficulty somewhat. And, of course, those strategic waterways tend to be either well within the enemy's territory or at least very well defended by the enemy, which makes actually getting to them in the first place somewhat difficult. So, and then you have things like Gibraltar. The Straits of Gibraltar are very strategically important, but whilst strategically important and relatively speaking narrow, they are nowhere near narrow enough for you to close them by sinking any reasonable number of ships. So there's very few circumstances where this would apply, and in those places will carry plenty of defences against such things. Panama Canal, to be honest, largely is protected by distance initially, and then, especially in World War II, the US fortifies the heck out of it, puts patrols and nets, etc., to stop someone either attacking the canal directly or a ship that's just about to transit into or out of the canal. The same with Suez. You've got the British fleet base at Alexandria nearby at the northern end, and the Axis is going to struggle to get anything to the southern end. But with both those places and places like harbours, one of the more favoured tricks was to try and use aerial dropped mines. Because if you use mines, it eliminates the need to arrive over the target area at a specific time to target a specific vessel, which also happens to increase the difficulty involved. Whereas if you just drop a bunch of aerial mines, well, you can close down shipping without ever having hit a ship, because if they know that you've dropped mines, they're going to want to clear those mines just in case something does get hit in an opportune place. So whilst they're working on that, the shipping stopped just as well as if you had physically blocked the channel. And of course, if they miss one, or they miss your mine laying efforts and someone runs into one, well, then that ship is going to get sunk, hopefully in a relatively important strategic position, without you having to be there, which then means obviously your mine laying operations can take place at night or under a specific operation with a lot of heavy cover or something like that. And for that reason, a lot of these strategically important waterways would have regular minesweeping efforts done. Sam Signorelli asks, how formidable would the Vasa have been if her stability issue had been addressed and solved before her ill-fated and relatively short maiden-only voyage? In theory, actually, Vasa would have been an incredibly powerful ship for the time. Now, granted, she didn't carry quite as many guns as some ships. She was notionally had 64 guns, of which 48 were her main battery, so 24 guns per broadside. But all of them were 24-pounders of those 48. As I actually had a few smaller guns, same as everyone else, but the gun decks themselves, the two main rows of guns, are all 24-pounders. Now, when you compare that to ships that were built a decade or two later, like Sovereign of the Seas, now granted, Sovereign of the Seas does have 42-pounders and 32-pounders in her lower gun deck, and she has 3 decks of guns. However, even a ship like Sovereign of the Seas, and bear in mind she's pretty much the be-all and end-all of capital ship construction at the time. She doesn't have sisters. Vasa pretty much does, or half-sisters at least. Above that gun deck level, Sovereign of the Sea's next guns are mostly 18-pounders, and then it drops off again to 9-pounders. And it's pretty much the same thing with all late 1500s, early 1600s warships that top out at over 100 guns or close to it. The actual heavy smashing battery, if you like, is a proportion of their overall gun numbers, whereas on below 50%. Whereas on Vasa, the vast majority of all the guns she could bring to bear are heavy guns. Now, granted, a 24-pounder isn't a 42 or a 32-pounder, but it's still a pretty heavy gun. 24-pounders would still be seen as pretty respectable weapons across the board, right up into the middle of the 1700s, at which point 32-pounders became kind of the standard minimum for main guns for ships of the line, but that's almost 150 years ahead of when she's constructed. So to have that second deck of 24-pounders would mean that her ship-killing power was considerable if she'd gotten into a one-on-one fight. You might liken it to, and it's not an exact analogy, but you might liken it to, say, a pre-dreadnought that has obviously a few 12-inch guns and then a bunch of 6 or 7.5-inch or something like that secondaries, let's say 6-inch secondaries, so classic pre-dreadnought. Obviously that's got a lot of guns, but then you might compare it with, say, something like SMS Blücher, or maybe an early heavy cruiser on the other side of World War One. The total number of guns a ship like that has is overall significantly less than the pre-dreadnought, and the biggest guns on the pre-dreadnought will hit a lot harder than the 8 or 8.2 or 8.3-inch guns on the Blücher or Pensacola or something like that. But there's a lot more of that sort of mid to upper weight hitting power on the cruiser than there is on the pre-dreadnought. And so as long as armour isn't a thing that's coming into play, like, say, at the first night action of Guadalcanal, because the range is too close, or in the case of Vasa, because they didn't really have armour. They had thick wooden hulls, but they're not going to stop a 24-pounder or 32-pounder ball at close range. Then all of a sudden, that proliferation of pretty decent ship-killing power suddenly becomes very, very important. Classe Cornate asks, why was it so hard to get speed above 30 knots? Is it that drag is exponential? So, at its core, and many thanks to John McCarthy for suggesting this particular photo, the amount of power you need to reach a certain speed increases at an absolute minimum as a square, and if depending on what factors are governing it, can even go up to almost as much as a cube of the speed involved once you've worked out the correct ratios. Now, there are a number of things that you can do to mitigate the amount of power increase you need. So having a much longer length to beam ratio, for example, squat ships that have a short length to beam ratio take a lot more power to get up to a certain speed than longer vessels. You can obviously change the bow shape, the stern shape, the overall hydrodynamics of the hull. You can introduce a bulbous bow. All these kind of things will reduce the amount of power that you need to get up to a given speed. But fundamentally, when you start accelerating to very high speeds through water, i.e. the high 20s, low 30s, or possibly even higher of knots, you end up needing an absolutely ridiculous amount of power to get there. Far more than you'd need to get to a slightly lower speed. There's a reason that, for example, that both fast battleships of World War II tended to be around the 28 knot margin, and why even these days, when you look at some more modern ships, a lot of them, now that the requirement for absolute speed is not necessarily so much a thing, are beginning to drop down into this kind of 28 knot regimen, because around 28 knots seems to be a kind of sweet spot where you still need a fair amount of power to get there, but the power requirements haven't started to get truly ridiculous the way they do once you start trying to push over 30 knots. Now, as I mentioned, working out the exact amount of drag and therefore the exact amount of power that you're going to need requires a lot of complicated formula and modelling. However, again, as a very crude analogy, you can think of something in terms of the kinetic energy equation. So the kinetic energy equation is relatively simple. Ke equals half mv squared, i.e. the kinetic energy of an object is equal to its mass multiplied by its velocity squared, and then halve the entire product. Now, of course, this means that if an object moves faster, it has considerably more kinetic energy. You can obviously increase the amount of kinetic energy by increasing the mass, but that doesn't increase the amount of kinetic energy as much. So, for example, if you have a 1 kilogram object moving at 10 meters per second, and you decide, okay, well, that's a given amount of kinetic energy. If you double the mass, so you now have a 2 kilogram object moving at 10 meters per second, your kinetic energy increases a little bit. But if you double the speed instead, so you've got a 1 kilogram object moving at 20 meters per second, that's going to hit a lot harder than your 10 meter per second 2 kilogram object. Now, what does that mean for ships and drag and moving through water? Well, remember, one of Newton's laws of motion: for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. So the sea, well, it's not usually static, but let's treat it as static for the purposes of this, so ignoring currents and such like. But consider the ship as a projectile. It is moving forward, hopefully, with a certain amount of kinetic energy that's determined by its mass and its velocity. But in order to move through the water, and to a lesser extent through the air, but because air is roughly 1,000 times less dense than water, it doesn't really make too much difference unless the wind really picks up. When it's moving through that water, it is exerting a certain amount of energy on the water ahead of it. And therefore, there will be an equal and opposite reaction pushing back. Now, obviously, the water will go around the side of the ship, etc., etc., so it does get a little bit more complicated, but say it's a crude analogy. But then hopefully that you can then see that if you're moving at 20 knots, the amount of kinetic energy that the ship has moving forward, and therefore the equal and opposite reaction that it's facing, will be one value. If you move up to 30 knots, the amount of kinetic energy the ship has massively increased, and therefore the equal and opposite reaction has massively increased. And therefore, if it's being pushed back against by this much greater force, you're going to need an awful lot more power to push back against it, rather than, 20 to 30 knots on the face of it might suggest just a 50% increase in power, which is not in any way, shape or form going to get you anywhere close to 30 knots if you have a baseline power plant that can move you at 20 knots originally. Leo Martin asks, how did submarines and aircraft identify enemy submarines as a foe as opposed to friend? It would be a combination of methods. These days, of course, you can use things like passive sonar to distinguish particular profiles and sounds of submarines moving underwater. Back in those days, whilst submarine hydrophones and hydrophones mounted to surface vessels did exist, and a particularly skilled operator might be able to pick out a particularly well-known type of propeller going through the water, for the most part, the kind of passive detection and identification that can be done these days wasn't a thing in World War II. So if the submarine was underwater, it was usually simply a case of operational areas. So a given power or navy would say, right, our submarines are going to operate in these areas, and they would tell the submarines, don't operate in these other areas. Thus, unless you had specific orders otherwise, submarines that were operating in a specific zone could be considered hostile as long as you detected some kind of underwater vehicle. So, for example, British fleet submarines, like the T-class, would not operate in the middle of the Atlantic. Therefore, when there were convoys going, if the escorts detected a submarine underwater, whether by hydrophones or by sonar, they could be reasonably certain that they were not detecting a friendly submarine. Now, where you get issues like, say, the North Sea or the Channel, where Allied submarines have every reason to operate, but also so do the enemy, it becomes a lot more difficult. At that point, you have to mark out things like specific transit channels, and obviously keep them very secret, or specific times when your submarines might be operational, keep them secret, except for obviously the ships that are going to be operating in the area, and so on and so forth. It gets a lot more granular, but on a larger scale, you could just say, well, we won't have submarines in this operational area unless we specifically say otherwise for a certain time period. Now, on top of that, if the submarine's on the surface, you can attempt to perform a visual identification. So you can see here the profiles of a number of different submarines from World War II. And this kind of profile booklet would be handed out to ships, aircraft, other subs, etc. that might be expected to encounter an enemy submarine. And the commanders and crew would be expected to try and memorize the general shapes of the subs and their sails and the location of some of their main guns, and then obviously they could also consult with these when it, or if they spotted a submarine on the surface, and so you could use these differences in the sail position, the sail shape, etc., and so on, to work out whether or not this submarine was likely to be hostile or not, if indeed that was potentially called into question. Obviously, if it's in the middle of a zone where you absolutely know there's no friendly subs, then you probably skip that stage. And you'd have a similar set of exercises if you were operating from an aircraft. Obviously, your perspective is slightly different, but you would still have some views and profiles in various elements of your booklet that would tell you exactly whether or not the submarine was friendly. And as a final layer of security and defense, if you were in a position to be comfortable doing so, and there was still some question as to whether or not the submarine was friendly, you of course would have coded signals and responses, so usually sent by messenger signal lamp, could also do it by radio, I suppose, and that would give you a challenge, and then if the submarine didn't give the correct coded response, then you would assume it was an enemy. Maraxis asks, you mentioned that Nelson was considered for a post-war refit. What would this have looked like, and can you guess on what her post-refit service would have been? So we don't know exactly what the late war modernisation plans were. There are some surviving documents that indicate what they were thinking of in terms of modernisation in the late 1930s, i.e. immediately pre-war. And that was quite extensive, but you've got to bear in mind that was, again, designed under the auspices of what are we going to do with these ships when it comes their turn for modernisation under the general modernisation scheme that would have had the R-class and the QEs progressively replaced by King George V's Lions and Lion successors. Now, in pre-war, they were looking at replacing the ship's internal armour, because Nelson had an internal sloped belt, and they were looking at replacing that with an external belt instead to free up some more space internally. They were also going to use modernised machinery to ramp up the horsepower quite considerably. That would have increased Nelson's default speed to probably 25-26 knots, something along those lines. They were going to replace the secondary battery, which originally obviously was twin 6-inch guns, with 5.25-inch mountings to give it approximately the same anti-aircraft broadside as a King George V, albeit that given where those mountings are aft and what their arcs of fire would have been, it might well have had a slightly higher overall heavy AA broadside, because some of those guns might have been able to fire cross-deck. Then obviously you would have had pom-poms, etc. Then they were also considering new permanent aircraft arrangements with a hangar, a new bridge that looked a bit more like what you see on Warspite, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, and taking out the torpedo tubes. Now obviously, going post-war with that, I think there would have been a few changes. The re-armouring to give yourself more internal volume, amongst other things, yeah, that probably would have gone ahead. The new machinery, yes, again, probably would have gone ahead. In fact, probably have even more power output. So you might have been able to push the speed up slightly higher still, or perhaps more likely reduce the overall space needed for the machinery still more in order to get maybe to 25, 26 knots still, but save more weight for re-armouring, say, the deck against air attack. The heavy anti-aircraft guns, by that point, they're probably not going to be using the 5.25s. I suspect they probably would have used the 4.5s, especially because you would have had the Daring's twin 4.5-inch mounts available at that point, and those would have been a lot easier and lighter to fit, and possibly also more numerous than the 5.25s. Obviously, aircraft would no longer be needed, so they'll probably have extensive radar instead, probably using a similar kind of Vanguard, Queen Elizabeth Valiant style bridge, and the torpedo tubes also would have been removed. The main armament obviously would have stayed the same, and light armament, depending on exactly when the refit was carried out, if it was done immediately post-war, if they'd somehow found the money for that, it probably would have consisted of sextuple 40mm Bofors, similar to what they stuck on Vanguard. If it was done in the late 40s or even somehow the early 50s, then it probably would have consisted of twin auto-loading 3-inch guns. At which point, there's actually something of an argument you could make that if they are conducting it in that later period of time, well, the difference in actual firepower between the twin auto-loading 3-inch and the twin 4.5s is probably not large enough to justify having both at the same time. So you might well have seen at that point maybe them going either we'll just go with slightly more 4.5s, or perhaps more likely we'll just stick an absolute ton of automatic 3-inch on there, similar to the mounts that you saw on the Tiger class cruisers. So yeah, that's probably what you would have seen a post-war refit Nelson as. The main reason it was ditched, apart from cost and the fact that Britain after World War II really didn't have a lot of money at all, was the fact that even if she was able to make 26 knots, or even if they'd gone for broke with post-war machinery and maybe tried to push 27 to 28 knots, she's still not fast enough to operate ideally with the carriers. There's a reason the King George V's went into reserve and Vanguard was kept, rather than Vanguard going into reserve and one of King George V's being kept out, and a large part of that was due to her speed. So it would be very difficult for her to find a role in the post-war environment, unless potentially, because bear in mind that one of the things that Vanguard was thought of as good for a while was as a Sverdlov cruiser killer, to defend Allied convoys. Well, the thing is, if you've got a ship that can do 25, 26 knots, it doesn't need to be able to chase down and kill Sverdlovs the way that Vanguard could, because if the Sverdlovs don't come after the convoy because they're scared of the modernised Nelson, then, well, job done. So at that point, she only needs to be fast enough to be able to position herself in a guard position in the convoy rather than anything faster. So the only real outside potential realistic scenario in which Nelson is modernised in post-war Britain would probably be if someone had decided the operating costs of Vanguard were too high and had decided that maybe the operating costs of a smaller modernised Nelson in a much more limited capacity, obviously as basically a big convoy escort, would somehow justify the significant expense of refitting her in the first place, which is a very strange and convoluted way of thinking, but given that it is strange, convoluted and partially nonsensical, I wouldn't exactly put it past British politicians to come up with it. Sky asks, how were battleship guns fired? Trigger, button, lanyard, etc. Early on, lanyards and other kinds of direct physical methods, and those were still retained in battleships later on as emergency backups. But for the vast majority of the time period that the Channel covers, at least in the 20th century element of it, when you're talking about full-on battleships with turrets and central fire control systems, it would be by button press. So here, for example, is the fire control unit for HMS Cavalier, which, okay, granted it's a destroyer, but, you know, you take what you can get, in Chatham Dockyard. And as you can see, there are no lanyards to be pulled because, well, it's in the middle of the ship, a few decks down, well away from the guns. There's no sort of big trigger there, but there are a lot of buttons, and one of those buttons is the button that you press to fire the guns. So that's how it's done. And if you go on, say, HMS Belfast, or indeed on Cavalier herself, you'll also see that there are options to fire the gun via button press on the bridge, as well as from a couple of other locations. Admiral Tiberius asks, was the Spanish 140-gun first-rate Trinidad too much ship to be combat effective? She appeared to do very little at Trafalgar. Well, to give her a full name, the Nuestra Señora de la Santísima Trinidad, and no, I have no idea how they fitted that on the stern, was kind of combat effective at Trafalgar. She wasn't the ideal vessel. The funny thing is, she started life as a fairly large and powerful three-decker first-rate ship of the line, and in that role, she was actually pretty solid, relatively quick, relatively agile, very well armed. You know, a really good example of what you could do to build a first-rate ship of the line. And then some benighted genius came up with the idea of giving her an extra gun deck. So she now had 4 gun decks, and then obviously that meant her total number of guns went up as well. And she immediately became about as manoeuvrable as a barn, which led to a lot of, should we say, unhappy Spanish sailors. At one point early on, because when she was launched, even as a 3-decker, she was one of, if not the biggest and most powerful ship of the line in the world. She was initially nicknamed El Poderoso, or the Mighty, and after her conversion, she became, at least to some of her more cynical crew, El Ponderoso, the Ponderous, which now fitted her name quite a lot better. But anyway, I mean, she was almost captured well before Trafalgar at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent. She actually struck her colours, but the British weren't able to get anyone to her in time before another Spanish ship, the Infante Don Pelayo, showed up to give her a tow and took her away. So that's why she was at Trafalgar in the first place. Now, at Trafalgar, the battle was fought under very light winds, so as you might imagine, a relatively slow and clumsy, gigantic ship of the line like Santísima Trinidad, in light winds basically was almost non-manoeuvrable and immobile. But her sheer size and the sheer number of guns she carried, albeit they had been reduced slightly from her initial refit to a 4-decker, meant that she was more of a semi-mobile fortress than a ship. So whilst she wasn't really able to come to the assistance of anybody else, it did take an awful lot of gunfire to actually put her down. Bear in mind that obviously the majority of the British fleet, much like the majority of the Franco-Spanish fleet, were third rates, 74 gunners. So in theory, those ships can bring to bear 36, 37 guns per side, per broadside, not including any additional ones they might be carrying, whereas Santísima Trinidad is, depending on exactly which source you believe, how many guns she's actually carrying at this point, but she is bringing to bear at least the mid-60s, possibly even low 70s of guns per broadside. So she's putting out a broadside that, at least in terms of number of guns, is about double what a third-rate attacking her can put out. Admittedly, she's not putting it out quite as often, but you don't want to be in the way of that broadside when it does go off. And so multiple British warships would end up engaging her and then eventually falling away, drifting away to go and fight somebody else as the exchange took a toll on them. But this was kind of where her almost immobility came to haunt her, because whereas a slightly more agile ship might have been able to take advantage of that and chase down battered opponent and try and force them into surrender at penalty of yet another massive broadside. With Santa Isabel Trinidad, as long as the British ship hadn't been dismasted completely, it could just leave, and then another one could come along, a fresh one, and take up the fight. And this basically wore down the ship over the day, so that eventually, once some of her masts started to fall, she had to surrender and was then taken in tow, but unfortunately didn't survive the storm that followed the Battle of Trafalgar. And that brings this particular episode of the Drydock to an end. Thank you very much for listening. No particular channel admin or other announcements to make this week, although hopefully we should have a initial schedule for the US trip available for everyone to have a look at next week. So other than that, stay safe everyone, and see you again in another video.